I think I have way too many bikes. It's a cloudy, overcast day, and I'm gonna go through some of these bikes that need to go to the scrapyard. Let's start with this little thing. Why doesn't this Ross have any handlebars? Probably because I took the handlebars off to fit the bike in the car like a long time ago, and now they're long gone. But it's a cool little Ross, and it used to be in like really good condition until I left it in the elements for 5 or 6 or however many years. So now it's basically a little piece of junk, and it's going to the scrapyard. Sorry. Next up we have the clown bike, and these are funny because I can't tell you how many times I've seen these on Craigslist and people think they're some crazy valuable thing. So they'll have it listed on there for like 200 bucks. It's kind of a cool bike, I guess. You can sit on it if you're an adult and ride around and look really cool. But this one is in rough condition, so I'll toss it in the pile at the scrapyard, and maybe the guys there will salvage it. They pick up a lot of bikes. Next up is this Saintropez La Sport. There's your Saint-Tropez logo. And there's where it said La Sport. And I actually shot a decent video about this, so I won't talk about it too much here, but I will mention that this is the bike that donated its handlebars for that Peugeot single speed build I did a while back. So thank you, Saintropez La Sport, for the handlebars. Now another bike that everyone thinks is valuable, but I don't think is the Fuji folding mountain bike. I think these were originally made available by Marlboro Cigarettes as a prize you could win, ironically enough. Like, why would you want to smoke a bunch of cigarettes and then go ride a mountain bike? But it's kind of a cool design. It's got this pivot in the middle of the frame, and then the seat tube is like a locking mechanism for the pivot. So you pull the seat post out and then you can fold the frame, if that makes any sense. And then the rest of the pivot mechanism is down at this bottom bracket. And if this thing looks flimsy and flexy, well, that's because it is. Surprisingly, this thing has 4130 chromoly tubing, and it has what I consider to be like the coolest cable routing ever. See, on the side here? Other than that, it's a pretty normal mountain bike. And you know what, maybe I'll take this one aside and make a completely separate video about it. That takes me down the time vortex though, so who knows? Now next in the scrapyard pile is this thing called a Diamondback Parkway, and I feel bad for this bike because it really hasn't done anything wrong to me, but I've done some wrong things to it. Like, first of all, somewhere along the line I lost the seat post and seat, or maybe it never had it, but I think I lost it. So that's kind of sad. And then the back wheel, I think I took the back wheel out and gave it to somebody, or used the tube or the tire. So it used to have a back wheel. And see how this crank arm over here doesn't have a pedal, but the crank arm over here does have a pedal? That's because I lost the left pedal, which I used to do all the time. I take the left pedal off so the bike fits on the bike rack better, and then I lose the pedal. But apart from those problems, which are entirely my fault, this looks like a pretty decent hybrid bike. It's the Diamondback Parkway, and there's the Parkway logo right there. And it's got this really cool swoopy frame. It looks like it's made out of aluminum, but it's actually made out of steel, but that's not really a problem. And it has an adjustable stem, as was popular on hybrid bikes from this era. And then your suspension fork, which makes it nice and comfortable to ride. So it's kind of a shame that this thing's going to the scrapyard, so maybe I won't do that. Maybe I'll just toss it on the curb and let somebody fix it up. Now the more I go through this pile, the more I'm thinking that maybe I shouldn't throw any of this stuff in the scrapyard, because this is what you call an Adams trailer bike. This is one of those bikes that's like a trailer, and you can put it on the back of mom or dad's bike so a little kid can ride. Like, effectively it makes a mountain bike or a hybrid bike into a tandem, and the kid gets to ride on the back of the tandem, which is pretty fun. It's got little handlebars that come out, and this thing folds in the middle for easy storage and transport. And a lot of these trailer bikes are just one speed, but this one looks like it has 5 gears in the back, so the kid can shift gears and have fun pedaling. I don't really know how that helps, but maybe it helps propel the whole contraption a little bit. Now the problem with this bike, other than the rusty chain, is that the junction where it connects to the parent's bike is mostly missing, and the kind of person who's going to buy this bike probably doesn't really know how to source those parts or fix a bike. So normally I get like 45 bucks for these things on Craigslist, but this one I bet I'd have a hard time getting $10 for it. So I don't know, maybe I'll put it on the curb or maybe I'll just throw it in a pile. Now here's one bike I don't feel bad at all about scrapping, which is the Mongoose Spectra full suspension mountain bike. See, it's got that big Mongoose logo and then full suspension performance, and then I guess it's called the Show Spectra, not just the Spectra. Okay, but I've never been a fan of these sort of full suspension Walmart mountain bikes. I mean, I will grant that they're comfortable to ride. They're kind of clunky and everything, they're hard to get in tune, but you know, here's some of the drawbacks to this bike. First of all, the wheels are entirely steel, which makes the bike pretty heavy because the frame is steel and the crank is steel. And then these brakes, they're stamped steel too, which just makes them really, really hard to tune and adjust and get to work correctly. And all the parts are cheap, like the brakes are entirely plastic. I mean, the brake levers, even the stem is this cheap quill stem. I understand that this bike probably cost, you know, $149 when it was new, so you can't really expect much, but I think these bikes are a little bit misleading. They look like a downhill mountain bike and they're really just a heavy, uncomfortable jalopy. But like I said, if you're just riding around, if you're just riding up and down the street, then they can be kind of comfortable as long as you don't mind the fact that the gears don't shift right and the chain can bind up and the brakes don't work and so on and so forth. But that's the Mongoose Show Spectra. I know this one guy who does these storage unit cleanouts, and he had one of these Royce Union bikes and somehow he was convinced it was worth $500. So this is the Royce Union Static BMX bike, and it's a pretty wild looking bike, I'll give it that. See, what they did on this bike is they just copied a whole bunch of stuff, like the frame platform that had been around forever, and the snake sort of drain pipe seat post, and the double crossbar handlebars, which definitely would have made sense in the 80s, but they don't really make sense now. And I think this bike came out in like the early 2000s or the 90s. The fork design is like a landing gear ripoff. And surprise, surprise, the brakes aren't a ripoff at all. They're actual Diacomp Bulldogs. Imagine that. And they have real Diacomp levers too. All right, I'm mildly impressed. The stem, I think this is a copy of a piston stem, which I think was by GT. I could be totally wrong. And I can't fault Royce Union for copying Shimano DX pedals, because everybody does that. Of course, you got GT's down tube curve, you know, to clear the brakes for bar spin tricks. And even though this is clearly a freestyle bike, it has knobby, like super gnarly tires on it. They're a little bit cracked. Now, on the bright side, it has these alloy 48 spoke wheels, which look pretty decent. I mean, it's better than having some crappy steel wheels on there. And overall, even though everything on it's really derivative, it is a pretty cool looking bike. Like, I can see how a kid could get excited about this. And I could see how maybe one kid who had it as a kid would go on eBay and buy it for $500, and that's why my buddy thought it was worth $500. So that's the Royce Union Static. Kind of cool. Now, next up we got some half mixty action, which means that unlike a normal mixty where these two tubes go all the way to the front, this bike just has two tubes that go from the seat tube to the dropouts. This thing is called the Outpost Trail, and it's by a company called GT, which stands for Gary Turner. And sadly enough, since it's a female bike, it doesn't have the GT triple triangle, which I like, but it does have this GT seat. I have mixed feelings about this bike because I think it's kinda ugly, but at the same time it's a pretty decent bike, and I don't think it was designed to be pretty. It has these cool looking U-brakes. Those were on mountain bikes for a little while, but they didn't really last because honestly they don't work quite as well as cantilever brakes unless they're totally tuned up correctly, which a lot of the time they aren't. And this bike has thumb shifters, which I like because they're reliable, but I think they were kind of getting old at this point, so this might have been more of a bug than a feature. But even though the one on the other side is totally broken, like look over here, I bet that shifter still works just fine. It's just missing its little trim cap. And out front, of course, you have the usual cantilever brakes. So I'm gonna guess that you could do endos on this bike really easily, but back wheel hops might be a little harder. And in the front, that's a really smooth looking hub. Let's see what kind of hub they have out back. See, out back the hub is a little tricky because it looks like it's a smooth alloy hub, but I think it's just a stamped steel hub. But whatever, it's not that big a deal. It's just a back hub. And then the final thing I'm gonna look at is this GT fork, which is kind of like almost like a BMX fork, except it's got a little curve to it. So that was a pretty cool fork design, instead of just having like a tapered leg fork. So bravo on the GT Outpost Trail and its cool fork. Now next up we have the Schwinn's High Plains 3.6 FS, and I really don't know what that means. I get the High Plains is just a name. The 3.6 I don't know. I don't see anything on this bike that's 3 and 6 because the gears are 3 and 7. The FS front suspension, and it does have front suspension, which is handled by this really cool looking Mozo fork. But even though it's cool looking, it is just a cheap steel fork. You know, it's got some paint scrapes and rust here. The wheels have these Schwinn machined alloy rims, and then if you come up here, we've got, I guess, machined alloy hubs, and they're quick release in the front and nutted in the back. Then on the frame, there's this pretty big, cool Schwinn logo too, which looks even bigger and cooler in the wide angle lens. The derailleurs don't look that impressive. They're just kind of steel, even out back, but they probably do the job just fine. And out back here you got 7 gears, so it's a 21 speed mountain bike. And then on the stem and handlebars you have that red Schwinn stripe logo that they were using on the XS parts at the time. I don't know, it kind of clashes with the rest of the bike, but it's a touch. Now, like a lot of other bikes that I find, this one is missing the seat and seat post. I don't know if that was my fault or if it was missing it when I got it, but seats and seat posts can be a pain to find, especially if you don't want to pay for them. So that's probably why I never did anything with this bike. Now behind the Schwinn is this adorable little Jamis Laser. This is a little kid's bike. It has 20-inch wheels. It has a steel frame that's big and boxy, like, well, not boxy, but big, like almost like it looks like an aluminum frame, but it's steel. The seat has these great graphics. It looks like laser beams shooting out of a superhero's eyes or something. And I guess that makes sense because the name of the bike is Laser. So, laser beams on the Laser. This bike is in rough condition, but it's certainly salvageable. It's just not really worth it for me to try and salvage it because the people who buy these bikes want them for like $10 and they want them to be perfect. And I just can't give people perfect bikes for 10 bucks. Sorry. But these fork decals, they're pretty perfect. They carry that red and black and white theme all the way to the BMX style fork. And out back we have a V-brake, so the little kid who's riding this can learn how to use handlebar brakes. But then we also have a coaster brake just in case he or she is not used to it yet. And it's a little hard to see in there, but this is called the MX Moto Frame. So I guess it's designed to evoke ideas of a motorcycle or a dirt bike. And the seat post is so low that it goes all the way down to the bottom bracket, but you can raise it up as the kid grows. And the final cool thing about this is the stem, which is basically a rip-off of a Redline forklifter. And if you're wondering why I'm not upset about this being a rip-off part, but all the parts on the Royce Union being ripped off, it's because all the parts on the Royce Union are ripped off, but this thing, just the stem, and it's a pretty cool looking stem even though it's totally scratched up. How on earth did that happen? Now next we have the Pacific Voyager mountain bike. This is like a really clean looking mountain bike, I'll give them that. It looks like, you know, a GT or anything. Pacific's a low-end brand, but this thing, it has style. It's got a great color to it. So Pacific bikes aren't really great bikes, but I think this might have been a decent bike in their lineup because other than the Pacific logo and the beautiful green paint, it has these legitimate grip shifters and full alloy brake levers. Then it has Shimano brakes and leaves and stuff on the tire. I don't think the leaves came stock though. The hubs are chrome plated steel, but the rims down here are aluminum alloy, so that makes them a little more lightweight than steel rims. The crank is a cheap steel crank. The derailleur is a mildly elaborate, though kind of cheap looking Shimano derailleur. And then out back we have Shimano SIS, which I think stands for index shifting. So this stuff isn't that bad. So even though normally I don't like Pacific bikes, I would say that this one it's adequate. Let's put it that way. You know, they did an okay job, and this thing probably wasn't that expensive in the first place. So bravo to Pacific for the Voyager. Now next up we have another Royce Union. And this is tempting me to make a whole video about these two Royce Unions because they're just so crazy. This one, let's take a closer look. This is called the 360 Hazard. And I don't really know where they got that name. A 360 is a BMX trick, I guess. And here's your Royce Union logo on the down tube, which definitely has a curve to it like an old GT down tube, although the head tube is really, really short on this bike, so it must be for like a little kid. Now, out back you have the T18 Pro Series freewheel, which refers to the back sprocket. So I don't know why they would put a decal over here to advertise the back sprocket, but these bike companies are weird sometimes. The rear wheel is a full alloy 48 spoke rear wheel, which is pretty impressive. And the front wheel is missing, but let's give it the benefit of the doubt and assume that it used to be a full alloy 48. Surprisingly enough, the brake levers are Diacomp, but the brakes are a brand that we used to call Cheapson. And right up here you have an Sst Orac Detangler. And just in case you forget what it is, right there on the fork, it tells you more about it. Sst Orac. And here's a really cool detail. A diagram to show you how to tighten your stem bolts. This thing has the same double crossbar handlebars as the Royce Union Static that we talked about earlier. And basically the same seat and seat post setup too. So I really have no idea why I have two Royce Union ultimate freestyle bikes, but I do, and that's the second one, the 360 Hazard. Next on the list is a bike by a brand called Vista, and I've had plenty of Vista bikes over the years, and this model is the Duchess, and that's probably because it's a girl's bike, so you wouldn't want to call it the Duke, right? This has a win stem on it, so if you're entering it into a race, I guess that means you could win. I don't see anything really too interesting about this bike. It's just a typical girl's 10-speed bike, probably from the 70s. Probably came from like Kmart or Sears or someplace like that. It's not a high-end bike. But with all due respect to Jesse James, I really like the yellow color. I don't know what this graphic is about. I mean, I suppose it's a V for Vista, but it's kind of a weird looking V. And then you go down and these are really similar to Schwinn forks. The brakes are actually Diacomp, so that's kind of cool. And the levers are Diacomp levers too, so I like that. Then you have that tall headset nut that is typical on cheap department store bikes. That's a weird looking nut. The front hub is cool looking. It's got like alloy flanges and a steel body. And then down below you just got typical steel rims with a little texture on the side to help with braking. The seat is padded vinyl, and the seat post is a little steel seat post with a steel seat post clamp. The cranks are just basic one-piece cranks, and you have sort of a triangular spider and two sprockets, steel with a pie plate. The front derailleur is a Suntour Sport, and if we go out back, the rear derailleur is labeled Vista, which I guess is appropriate. And then right up here on the wheel, really, really, really cool reflector. And up front, you got your Vista head tube badge, which is riveted in place. It's not just a decal. And that's the Vista Duchess. You know, one of many, many cheap 10-speed bikes you could buy in like, I don't know, late 60s, early 70s, something like that. And then last on our list of bikes that's going, or maybe going to the scrapyard today, the Huffy Mojave Gulch. Brands like Huffy like to make claims like multi-terrain, which I suppose means this is a hybrid bike more than just a mountain bike. And down here we see the Mojave Gulch logo, which is kind of hard to read. It took me a while. And it features 10-speed traction. Of course, mountain bikes should have 18 speeds even back then, so I guess they're trying to take a negative and turn it into a positive. And of course somebody left their cable lock on there. I don't have the key. Huffy was never afraid to use steel in their bikes, so you'd be hard pressed to find any aluminum on this thing. You got steel brakes, steel hubs, classic flat steel Huffy rims, steel cranks, one piece, steel seat post clamp, a steel stem, and deluxe plastic brake levers. Now I can't complain about any of the steel parts on this bike because this thing probably retailed for what, $69.95? Maybe $79.95 back in the 80s, so it was a cheap bike. And it looks pretty cool. It's got like yellow handlebars or fluorescent yellow. And look at that fork. And even the tires are kind of cool looking. See, they're not really gnarly off-road knobbies, but they have a little traction to them. So I guess that bolsters the claim that this is a multi-terrain bike. So would I recommend that you take this bike to the Mojave Gulch, wherever that is? Hell no. But to pedal it around the neighborhood, assuming that you could find the left pedal and a seat, yeah, go right ahead, why not? And that's Huffy Mojave Gulch, the last bike that's going to the scrapyard today. Thanks for watching. I decided not to take the bikes to the scrapyard. So what I did was I put them on Craigslist for free, big pile of bikes, and nobody wanted them. So ultimately I cobbled together 3 bikes that hopefully I'm going to be able to sell to a local shop for about 10 bucks each. This Schwinn, the High Plains FS 3.6, it now has the seat off of the Pacific. It's a little torn, but it does the job. And this Fuji, the folding bike that you can barely see because of the lighting, it got the back wheel off the Pacific and the tire off the Mongoose. And it also got this random Mongoose seat that I've had floating around forever. I don't know where I got it, but it looks better on the Fuji than it does on the floor of my carport. So I went from having a pile of scrap metal to 3 bikes that, you know, aren't really great, but I'm sure some homeless guy could ride them around, or some kid or something. So that's the outcome of the scrap metal bikes. The rest of them will go to the scrapyard on Monday, Wednesday. So from the city of Newburgh, New York, not quite as late as it looks based on the light. Friday night, September 28th, 2018. Thanks for watching.